Well, first of all, let me say that, of course, it's always very difficult to give advices, and maybe I can first explain a little bit why I became interested in Korea's global role, so global political role particularly. I found very fascinating the rise of Korea's global political role. Korea has only become a member of the UN in 1991 and then a member of the OECD in 1997, member of the Leaders G20 in 2008, member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee in 2010. So you can say that over the last 25 years there's been a massive increase of Korea's global role, and I found that fascinating. The second thing is that a couple of years back I became involved in some research project on the role of middle powers in international organizations. So middle powers, not large powers that are automatically relevant on the global level, but still middle powers that are relevant on the global stage, and how these middle powers can make their voice heard within international organizations and the international community. We tried to find out about this. So we found there were basically two different groups of these countries, the so-called regional leaders, what we call regional leaders, so countries that claim to represent a certain region. Let's say South Africa, for example, representing the Africa. For Korea, this was not really an option to be a regional leader within East Asia, given that Korea is a relatively small country between Japan and China. So maybe Korea could be like a mediator, but certainly not like representing East Asia as a region. So there was the other group, the so-called issue leaders, those countries who made their voice heard on the global level within one specific field, policy field, for example. And Korea, we found, was actually doing quite well, was quite successful in establishing itself as an issue leader within the field of development. And so that's how I became kind of interested in Korea's role as a new middle power, but also in the field of development cooperation. And I think the role of Korea as a new player in development cooperation and as a new donor is very meaningful. I mean, for many years in the international donor community, there was talk about the donor fatigue. There was a lot of doubt about if development aid works at all. So it was great to have new players like Korea joining the international donor communities, bringing in new money, but also new ideas. Right? So this was. I think that Korea can play a very important role in this field, and my advice would basically be to continue improving development aid, the effectiveness of Korean development aid, include also the amount of spending. If you look at the numbers now, Korea is spending about 0.13% of its gross national income for official development assistance. This is the OECD DAC average is about 0.4%. So Korea is still much below that average. So it should slowly increase its development assistance for developing countries. Of course, nobody expects Korea to rapidly increase its development assistance. That is very difficult, and if you increase spending a lot during a short period of time, there's always the danger of a lot of that money is not spent effectively, that there's waste. Right? I think another thing that where Korea can have a very meaningful contribution is on the debate how to reform international institutions in the field of international development cooperation. For example, during the G20 summit here in Seoul in 2010, there was the new Seoul Development Consensus was discussed, and I think this new Seoul Development Consensus inspired many of its criticism of past one-size-fits-all development suggestions or development advices. And there was a new focus also on infrastructure and also on economic growth, as opposed to the previous focus on aid effectiveness and human development. Right? So I think this was a new, or definitely steered the discussion into in another direction, or was a good contribution. But there are also of course, problems with that. Right? So I'm not 100% concerned that all aspects of the Seoul Development Consensus are really a progress. And we also have to look, and I think for Korea, if I may give this advice, it would be important also not to, and not just for Korea, but also for other new donors like China particularly, it's important not to repeat the mistakes that the West has done in their development cooperation, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. There has been, for example, during that time, the development cooperation, development aid in these countries was very much focused on infrastructure and promoting growth as well. But there were a lot of problems. For example, a lot of infrastructure projects like building big dams in developing countries created not much growth, but a lot of environmental problems. A lot of the growth that was promoted through credits then later led to a debt crisis. And also a lot of that growth that was then created did not really help those most vulnerable or those poorest. So like a new focus on economic growth should not come as at the expense of development assistance or development aid promoting human development. So, for example, I would be very happy to see an even stronger role of Korea in the debate on the post-MDG, the post-Millennium Development Goals process in promoting human development. This would be my advice. This would be my answer to the first question.
잠깐 스톱했다가.
Well, I think the biggest contribution that Korea has already given to developing countries is showing developing countries and the whole world that it is possible to develop. So there are a lot of lessons from the Korean development, successful Korean development experience. So I think most important thing is to study very carefully and very comprehensively the Korean development experience, and then also see what kind of lessons can be learned by developing countries. So in the past, this has been done through the knowledge-sharing programs by Korea, and I think that was very important. But also, I think even more important, it would be to for Korea to invite scholars from developing countries, students from developing countries to Korea to study the Korean development experience. To see, it's difficult to just transfer lessons from Korea to the developing world, so it's important for scholars from the developing regions, students from the developing regions to analyze, to look at Korea from their perspective, and also from the issues that their own countries have. So I think there could much more could be done. I mean, for example, in my university where I teach in Seoul, Ewha Women's University at the Graduate School of International Studies, we have a program where students from developing countries get a grant from KOICA to get their master degree. So I think that's great, but sometimes we get the impression that KOICA is mostly interested, Korea, the Korean Development Agency, mostly interested in like having as much students as possible through their program. But I think it will also be important, so they are only funding master students at that point, at this point. So I think it will be important to also fund PhD students, to fund postdocs and scholars, professors, invite professors from the developing world to teach and do research in Korea. I think that would be very important to kind of get a better understanding of the Korean development experience and make it work for the world. I mean, there's so many lessons from Korea's development. If we think about the whole issue of development planning, industrial policies, these are still highly, maybe less relevant today in Korea, but still very relevant for the developing world. Or if we think about issues of building your own national industries, infant industry protection, but then also at the same time not just protecting industries, but also supporting them to export, promote exports, etc., etc. So there are many. I mean, you could go on and on and on for the next not couple of minutes or hours, but the whole semester we could talk about kind of the lessons that could be learned from the Korean development experience. When it comes to then translating this into how could this kind of help Korea to become a good donor country? That is very difficult, because obviously development cooperation, Korea's relationship with the developing world, aid and is just one aspect of it. Right? There are also many other aspects. Economic interests of Korea. For example, the export interest, market access for Korean companies in the developing world. The interest of access to resources. There has been the example of the resource diplomacy in Korea, which is now very much criticized. And sometimes, you know, these interests, there are conflicting interests between. So, for example, Korea protected its own market to grow its own national industries. At the same time, now Korea is promoting free trade and free trade agreements with the developing world. So I think what would be important is for a country to be a good donor, and that's not just for a good partner in development cooperation, and that's not true just for Korea, basically that's true for all countries, is to take into account the interests of developing countries in all aspects of policies and foreign policies. Or if we think, for example, about the market access for developing countries to the Korean market, I think there could also be a lot of improvement there. Korea knows that exports play a very important role in development, yet still it is difficult, or can be difficult for products from developing countries to enter the Korean market. Right? So that all these issues, development cooperation is much more than just giving aid and maybe sharing experiences. It should kind of be reflected in many different fields. So, for example, on a very concrete level, what could be done I think it would be great to have like a Ministry of Development Cooperation, for example. I think that would be putting together all the development cooperation-related activities in one ministry. I think all the expertise in one ministry, that could be very important. Also, I think it would be, I think there has to be even more like not top-down approach in development cooperation, but a bottom-up approach. A development community consisting of NGOs and other civil society organizations, that where there is a like where there's a debate within the Korean society, what kind of relationship does Korea want to have with developing countries? And now it seems that sometimes development cooperation the business interest plays a very important role. And I hope that by having a broader debate, including NGOs and other civil society organizations, it would be the interest of the developing world could play a much more important role. Development cooperation should primarily be about development aid and about helping developing countries, and not an industrial policy to help support exports, for example, for Korea, or to have access to resources in the developing world. That is also that is a legitimate foreign policy, but it's not part of development cooperation. So these two should be separated.